couple of years ago, I came across this video. At first, I thought to myself, this is pretty adorable. But then I started wondering, who are those guys in the military fatigues? Well, it turns out they're Russians. But they're not soldiers or diplomats. They're mercenaries, fighters for the infamous and brutal Wagner Group. This video, it was shot in Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic. The story of what led to this video and what comes afterwards, it's really fascinating, and it takes place in a part of the world the West often forgets about. It's this intersection between terrorism, neocolonialism, the war in Ukraine, and the shifting alliances of the 21st century. It's also central to a story about how an eccentric warlord almost overthrew the Russian government, but how he flew just a little bit too close to the sun. Underneath all of this geopolitical jockeying is a very real humanitarian disaster. My name is Justin Ling, and this is Soft Power, a show all about diplomacy, security, aid, trade, spying, and how realpolitik shapes the world. This week, the story of how and why this troubled part of Africa attracted mercenaries, coups, terrorists, and Vladimir Putin. This story largely takes place in the Sahel and in West and Central Africa. Now, there is no way to do the history of this region justice in just a few minutes, but what you do need to know is that this area was key in the scramble for Africa, the period in the 19th century where a number of European countries raced to colonize the continent and often plundered its natural wealth in the process. This part of Africa declared its independence from France in 1960, and to make a really long story short, the ensuing decades were a real mixed bag. But coming into the 21st century, things were trending in the right direction. And then, two things happened. One is that civil war and uprisings during the Arab Spring spilled over into northern Africa, and it spurred some pretty brutal fighting in Libya. In 2011, a coalition of Western countries began bombing the military loyal to eccentric longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi.
And those still holding out must understand the old regime is over, and it is time to lay down your arms and join the new Libya.
The other thing that happened is south in Nigeria. An Islamist insurgency called Boko Haram had been committing some really horrific attacks and kidnappings.
It's more than 2 years since the 276 girls were taken. 218 remain captive. For their parents, closure will only come when they are finally brought home, safe. That day, they say, can't come soon enough.
So the Nigerian military launched a concerted effort to push back the extremists. Both of these things had some pretty unintended consequences. Many of Gaddafi's former soldiers fled south, and the remaining members of Boko Haram fled north. They went looking for work, a safe haven, a place to reconstitute their forces, and they found it in the Sahel. That's how we got the Islamic State Sahel province, located in the border regions between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. And they started launching waves of attacks and raids, both trying to expand their territory and to destabilize neighboring governments. And as if these two very dangerous trends weren't enough, there was also an array of different local conflicts, separatist uprisings, and regional unrest happening around the same time. By the early 2010s, these governments started to lose a lot of their land in this region. When that happened, several of those states turned to the United Nations and ultimately to France for help. Paris agreed to intervene, sending more than 4,000 soldiers, a squadron of fighter jets, and a variety of other military assets. They called it Operation Serval. And at the time, there was this real optimism that maybe Europe could actually help provide security to this part of the world without trying to recolonize them. Unfortunately, things didn't go very well. Paris pulled the plug and rebooted the mission, calling it this time Operation Barkhane, but that went even worse. Despite some early successes, France just couldn't commit to doing the things needed to stop the fighting. Paris wanted to win the war from the air, which rarely works in these kind of situations. They invested far too little in helping these countries build capacity to defend themselves and even enforce an arms embargo on the Central African Republic. While the international community had raced to fight the Islamic State when it seized land in Iraq and Syria, infinitely less money and attention went to the nearly identical situation in Central Africa. This region needed development dollars, more extensive security assistance, and political support. It didn't get it.
The presence of 4,500 French soldiers, along with 13,000 UN peacekeepers and African troops, has failed to stop the jihadist expansion.
As things got worse, anti-French sentiment began to grow. This narrative emerged both from the public and the media that accused France of half-assing the operation, of killing civilians, cooperating with different separatist groups, and using the conflict to steal Africa's natural resources. And there are kernels of truth to all of these things. But this is really where our story begins. In late 2018, the Russian government drew up plans to increase Moscow's influence over Africa. It picked a handful of countries where it hoped to set up shop. One was the Central African Republic, where the Kremlin aimed to help stabilize the government, defeat the insurgency, and perhaps most importantly, replace France. Documents obtained by the Dossier Center, an independent anti-corruption organization, and published by The Guardian show that Moscow had big plans. They drew up a contract to start a gold mining operation, they developed plans to open a military training center, and they even had a scheme to replace senior Central African politicians that they worried were a little too sympathetic to Paris. Making this an official, sanctioned government operation would draw way too much attention and require too much arms personnel and money. So instead, Putin turned to an old friend of his named Yevgeny Prigozhin. Prigozhin's origin story is wild. Let me just tell you the highlights here. He originally had planned to compete in the Winter Olympics for the Soviet Union, but he got injured and ended up turning to a life of crime. He served a few years in a prison colony, but was ultimately released just as the Soviet Union was disintegrating. Free and in a freshly capitalist country, Prigozhin opened, of all things, a hot dog stand. And then another, and then another, and by 1993 he owned his first $1 million. By the end of the decade, he owned a massive restaurant enterprise that spanned Europe, and in 2001, he personally catered a dinner between newly installed President Vladimir Putin and French President Jacques Chirac. Not long after that dinner, Prigozhin became one of Putin's most loyal and effective oligarchs. When Vladimir Putin decided to run an extensive fake news operation to get Donald Trump elected president in 2016, he turned to no other than Yevgeny Prigozhin to finance and run the so-called troll farm. Around this time is when mentions of the Wagner Group first begin appearing. It styled itself as a private military contractor, although its exploits over the years suggest it wasn't so private after all. It was led by a Russian neo-Nazi named Dmitry Yudkin. And over just a few years, its soldiers were embroiled in the shooting down of a civilian airliner in eastern Ukraine and in war crimes in the Syrian civil war. It was a force that seemed pretty willing to do Putin's dirty work. Many experts who follow Russia's global exploits suggested that the man behind the Wagner Group was none other than Yevgeny Prigozhin. And in 2018, as Russia eyed a bigger role for itself in Africa, it turned once more to the Wagner Group. Back in Africa, the struggle between the state and these extremists was continuing to worsen. France had all but given up in trying to help restore order to the region, and the civilian death toll was staggering. And so Moscow put its plan for Africa into effect. It made contact with the Central African Republic and offered to help. In short order, the Wagner Group sent somewhere around 1,000 soldiers to the country, and at first, it worked. The insurgents were on the run, Wagner was pummeling the Islamic State in particular, it was helping train local forces. It seemed like things were finally turning around. Now, trying to figure out exactly what Wagner was doing, where the money was going, where it was coming from, what their objectives were, it's all notoriously difficult to pin down. There is a lot of footage of Wagner mercenaries training local forces, fighting side by side with Central African soldiers, building infrastructure, playing with local kids. But this all came from Wagner channels directly. Prigozhin, perhaps more than anybody else, understands the importance of telling a really good story. And in 2021, he did this on a very big scale. One evening, thousands of Central Africans crowded into the Bartholomew Baganda Stadium in Bangui for the premiere of a movie called Tourist. It was a big budget blockbuster that had been shot right there in the capital. The movie, which is entirely in Russian, is this jam-packed action thriller. It tells the story of a team of Russian soldiers who arrive in Bangui to train local security forces, just like in real life. But in the movie, things grow pretty tense pretty quickly. Turns out there's an international conspiracy between the local Catholic Church and shadowy forces in Europe. And they have a plan to overthrow the local government, to take over all of Central Africa, and ultimately to exploit the region's resources and people. And in this telling, the only thing stopping this evil European neocolonialism scheme are these Russian soldiers. And surprise, the Russians win. The coup is thwarted, and the evil colonialists run away in shame. This premiere was a real red carpet affair. There was a parade of teenagers who went to the premiere wearing t-shirts with the film's poster on it. Russian and Central African officials presented the film, and it was a real symbolic moment for Russian-African relations. It's also worth pausing to underline just how unbelievably weird this is. At this point, the Russian government was not officially involved in the Central African Republic or anywhere else in the Sahel, and no one's really sure who owns or finances the Wagner Group, or this movie, for that matter. And then some eagle-eyed reporters watched this film and found an incredible clue. It's a scene from Tourist, a brief bit of exposition where a corrupt Catholic priest is colluding with a nefarious European official. This corrupt European official, he shows up on this small Cessna aircraft. And if you pause and zoom in, you can see the tail number of the plane. It's a real plane, and it's a real tail number, RA67717. Radio Free Europe connected that tail number to two shell companies, which in turn had been implicated in a massive gold and diamond smuggling operation in Africa. And all these companies were tied back to Prigozhin himself. This was the smoking gun that connected Prigozhin to Wagner, and that proved that Prigozhin and his mercenary firm were really in this country to enrich themselves. But this was just the beginning. So Wagner is, at least early on, posting some serious wins against these insurgents. It's becoming a cultural icon in this part of Africa, both for these movies and for the cultural cachet that Prigozhin has built around them. At the same time, they're pilfering millions of dollars from these countries. And then it drew up plans to move on. Its fighters started popping up in Sudan, Mali, Mozambique, and Libya. But they still had this one problem: the French. The Europeans were still ostensibly helping out the countries in the Sahel and West Africa, and those local governments were trying to balance their allegiance between Paris and Moscow. So now was the next part of the Kremlin's plan: run France out of Africa. To do that, Prigozhin decided to produce a different kind of movie. Around 2022, Wagner Group channels began publishing these cutesy cartoons. In them, France is depicted as a giant red-eyed rat burrowing through the homes of unassuming African villagers, or in another, French soldiers are mummified zombies lumbering through the streets. In yet another, France is a giant cobra destroying buildings like it's Godzilla. In these videos, the French president is depicted as this shadowy, nefarious figure, furious that his possessions in Africa are being threatened. In these short cartoons, the locals, desperate for help, see an ad for Wagner in the newspaper, and they call up the mercenaries. They arrive with machine guns, assault rifles, and even a sledgehammer to fight off the evil French invaders. These videos are set in Mali, where Wagner set up shop around mid-2021. But in the videos, the Wagner soldiers say their help is needed in Burkina Faso and Chad. And in these videos, the villains aren't just the jihadists and extremists who have been launching terror attacks and who have been trying to overthrow the somewhat democratic governments. It's the French themselves. And the only solution to this dangerous enemy is Wagner. These videos were just one part of a bigger strategy and one part of a bigger shift happening in the region. In the early 2020s, as the rest of the world was scrambling to deal with COVID-19, the Wagner Group was pumping more and more resources into the region. Soldiers, advisors, corporate raiders, money, weapons, and propaganda. And as they did, governments began to fall. A series of military-backed coups d'etats spread through the region, timed almost perfectly with the arrival and influence of the Wagner Group. First it was Mali, then Niger, Chad, Mali again, Guinea, 2 Burkina Faso coups back-to-back, and then Niger again. This region earned itself a new title: the Coup Belt.
Every country on this now volatile strip that stretches from the northeastern tiny state of Eritrea to another small country in the west called the Gambia, has managed to make history as a hotbed of coups.
Now, it would be wrong to say that the only factor in these coups were the Russian mercenaries, and we don't have any real firm evidence that the Wagner Group directly aided the mutineers and coup plotters. But without fail, each of these new military governments had a common priority: force France out of Africa and welcome Russia. And it worked. France exited Mali in 2022, Burkina Faso tore up its agreement with Paris in 2023, and Niger followed not long after. There, thousands of locals stormed the French embassy and raised Russian flags from its parapets. With France gone, Wagner forces poured into the region. After years of chaos, violence, and economic instability, there was, once again, this genuine optimism that if nothing else, even if it was driven out of greed and self-interest, that the Wagner Group was going to restore order. And that optimism was, once again, misplaced. Now, the Wagner Group has this trademark, maybe you've already seen it. It's this big sledgehammer. It's a bit confusing if you don't know where it comes from, but it tells you a lot about how the mercenary group really operates. This symbolism, it has a really dark origin. It dates back to the Wagner Group's first real operation in Syria. Wagner was there ostensibly to help fight the Islamic State, but in practice they were just hired goons for dictator Bashar al-Assad, and they earned a reputation as every bit as violent and ruthless as the terrorists who they said they were fighting. In 2017, Wagner fighters captured a man who had deserted from the Syrian army. The Wagner forces beat him, and they pummeled him with a sledgehammer. After that, they beheaded him and they set fire to the body. What's even worse is that they videotaped the whole thing and they published it online. Ever since then, the sledgehammer has been the Wagner Group calling card. Like I said, Yevgeny Prigozhin knows how to tell a story, even if it's a really macabre one. Now, Wagner brought that same brutality to the Sahel. Over the years, Wagner and Prigozhin himself was implicated in the murder of Russian journalists and scores of civilians. Like in Syria, Wagner also filmed these acts and posted it for the world to see on their Telegram channels. Evidence of Wagner's atrocities have piled up. An extensive Human Rights Watch investigation implicated Russian forces in the mass execution of unarmed civilians. United Nations experts say there is ample evidence that Wagner fighters have targeted peacekeepers and journalists. And as of 2025, the International Criminal Court has been investigating evidence of crimes against humanity committed by Wagner. And there's lots of evidence for it. Once again, Wagner has been filming and publishing these attacks and atrocities. And while there had been some early successes in the military campaign to fight these jihadists and insurgents, it had become clear after a few years that the Wagner Group was not quite as effective as they claimed to be. As Wagner's presence expanded, things in the region have actually worsened. They didn't actually do anything that brings about peace and stability. All they really know how to do is fight. Just as it seems like the Wagner Group's mission was being exposed as the fraud it was, something was brewing back in Russia that would really change things on the ground. As all of this is happening in Africa, things are going quite badly for Russia in Ukraine. Moscow had launched its special military operation in 2022, and it had relied heavily on the Wagner Group to supply fighters. But things were going quite poorly, and Prigozhin actually needed to redeploy some of his fighters from Africa and the Middle East to try and make up for the losses being suffered by the Russian military. Corruption, overconfidence, and incompetence in the Kremlin meant that Prigozhin's efforts were mostly in vain. Prigozhin and senior Wagner figures began openly challenging the Russian military leadership, which, in Vladimir Putin's Russia, is generally not allowed.
Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
Moscow responded by announcing plans to integrate the Wagner Group into the military hierarchy. Now, this would have essentially ended Prigozhin's semi-independence, and Prigozhin just refused. So it resulted in this strange stalemate that broke in the summer of 2023 in the so-called March of Justice. Basically, Prigozhin all of a sudden led thousands of Wagner forces out of eastern Ukraine and started towards Moscow. In a series of videos, Prigozhin announced that he was going to force a change of leadership in the Russian military. He had this huge column of tanks and armored personnel carriers, and they were heading straight for the Kremlin. Along the way, ordinary Russians came out to offer flowers and hugs, and it started to look like maybe the coup belt was going to extend all the way from the Sahel into Russia. Things looked pretty dire for Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin had not only seized tanks and welcomed defectors, he had even shot down 2 attack helicopters. Things were looking pretty dire for Vladimir Putin. And then, at the last minute, as he approached Moscow, Prigozhin just stopped. He announced in an audio statement that he would just be abandoning the insurrection. This anticlimactic resolution saw both sides broker a deal to exile Prigozhin to neighboring Belarus. In exchange, the warlord got his wish. Wagner would remain quasi-independent, its forces would continue fighting in Ukraine, and its security advisors would continue their work in the Sahel. Everything went back to this strange, uneasy sense of normal. But just 2 months into his exile, Prigozhin made a really strange decision. He came back. While we don't really know why exactly Prigozhin returned home, we know that his private jet took off from Moscow to St. Petersburg on August 23, 2023. On board was Dmitry Yutkin, the Wagner Group commander, and some other senior Wagner officials. About 100 kilometers into the flight, the plane lost altitude rapidly, a puff of smoke emerges from the plane's wing, and then the jet can be seen nosediving, falling to earth and exploding in a ball of fire. Everybody on board the flight was killed. Now, multiple investigations have concluded that Prigozhin's plane was probably brought down by a bomb installed under the wing, but Moscow has never confirmed that or provided really any full explanation. Vladimir Putin himself has said that Prigozhin was high on cocaine and suggested he may have been blown up by one of his own grenades. So, more likely than anything, Putin himself ordered the assassination to erase Prigozhin from the picture. And with him gone, Moscow moved to quickly cannibalize the Wagner Group. In the 2 years since Prigozhin's fiery death, the Wagner Group was put under the authority of the Russian National Guard. Its fighters still sport the Wagner Group patch, and its propaganda channels continue to celebrate the life and death of their former leader. But the criticism of the Kremlin has been more muted, its operations are less independent, and its objectives are even more closely aligned with those of Vladimir Putin. But the Kremlin went a step further when they established the Africa Corps. It is part of the Ministry of Defense, and it has already moved into several regions in Africa, either to work with or to take over from the Wagner Group. While we still don't know very much about the Africa Corps yet, beyond the fact that they're in Burkina Faso and Mali, it has moved quickly to impose Russia's will on the region. Now, this is a nakedly colonial exercise, on par with the immoral, brutal, anti-democratic, and transactional nature of France's colonialism from the 19th century. And it still isn't working. There are 2 main groups who now control a huge territory in the central Sahel, Jamaat Nasser al-Islam wal-Muslimin and the Islamic State Sahel province. While they've been fighting each other, they've also really successfully been fighting the militaries of these local governments, the Wagner Group, the Africa Corps, and everybody else. They now control a huge swath of territory across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. These groups rely heavily on smuggling and kidnapping to finance their expansion, and their success means that they have connections to other militant groups, and they have room to expand even further. These Russian groups, at the end of the day, don't really care about this, because they're looting and destabilizing these countries in much the same way. Globalism is a really weird thing. It means that a Russian warlord who got rich in the rubble of the Soviet Empire can be financing a propaganda film screening in Central Africa. It means that an American effort to oust a brutal dictator like Muammar Gaddafi can topple the dominoes that leads to a string of coups in a totally different part of Africa. It means that Africa, yet again, becomes a place where world powers jockey and compete for resources and influence, using plundered goods to finance a land war in Europe. And it means that Russians and Central Africans alike can enjoy the bubblegum pop of aqua. But looking back over the last decade in this part of the world, it's increasingly clear that the failures of rich Western countries left this opening for Wagner to swoop into Africa, entrenching itself and overturning civilian government. That failure has made the world less safe, and it's helped Russia finance and maintain its war machine. It's left people in this part of the world far worse off for it. Things in the Sahel and Central Africa are worse than they've been in decades. Instability is impoverishing a place that should be thriving, but this is not an intractable problem. Negative sentiment about Wagner and Russia is rising, although most people in the Sahel and West and Central Africa are still mostly unsure about the Russian government. Western media, particularly francophone countries like France and Canada, can help shed light on the atrocities being committed by Russian forces. These countries also need security assistance. The threat of these Islamist groups is massive, and if they can't be defeated, it could destabilize an ever wider area on the continent, and could even pose a threat to the rest of the world. These countries need aid. The United Nations says there are 29 million people in need of humanitarian assistance and protection in the Sahel alone. The UN says it would need $4.3 billion to help the most vulnerable population. And as of June, it's received just 8% of that total. As the United States and other countries actively cut back on foreign aid, this problem is only going to get worse. But if anything is going to get better in this region, the military dictatorships have got to go. The West needs to be pushing hard for a return to civilian government, because so long as these juntas are in power, Russia can continue bribing its way to influence. Until we do these things, these countries are going to opt for the easy solutions and the corruption of Russia, the Africa Corps, and the Wagner Group. That is it for this inaugural episode of Soft Power. I hope you found it interesting, and if you did, you should like this video and subscribe to us on YouTube. This episode was written and hosted by me, Justin Ling, and it was edited by Conway Gaskin. This show is made possible thanks to a very generous grant from Bigger Than Our Borders. If you want to find out more about them, head over to biggerthanourBorders.ca.